Margaret Thompson clutched the handle of her worn leather suitcase as the taxi pulled away from the curb, leaving her standing alone on the pristine sidewalk. The two-story colonial house before her gleamed white in the afternoon sun, its manicured lawn and carefully trimmed hedges a stark contrast to the cramped apartment she'd called home for the past 15 years. She took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders beneath her navy cardigan, and reminded herself that this was temporary, just until she could find something more affordable. The rent increase had been brutal, from $800 to $1,400 in a single month. At 67, living on a fixed pension of $1,200, the math was impossible. When she'd called David in tears, explaining her situation, there had been a long pause before her son reluctantly offered their guest room. "Just until you get back." "On your feet, Mom," he'd said, and she could hear Rebecca's voice in the background, sharp and questioning. Margaret pressed the doorbell, its melodic chime echoing through what sounded like a spacious interior. Through the frosted glass panels, she could see a figure approaching, tall, confident strides that could only belong to her daughter-in-law. The door swung open, revealing Rebecca's perfectly arranged smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. "Margaret," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the brittle cheerfulness of someone enduring an unwelcome interruption. "Right on time. Thank you so much for this, Rebecca. I know it's not ideal." "No, it's fine," Rebecca interrupted, stepping aside with obvious reluctance. "We're just adjusting our whole household routine, but it's fine." Margaret stepped into the foyer, her scuffed shoes silent on the polished hardwood floors. The house was everything she'd imagined from David's rare phone calls. Open floor plan, granite countertops visible from the entryway, and family photos arranged artfully on floating shelves. She noticed there were no pictures of her. "David's still at the office," Rebecca continued, already turning toward the kitchen. "Big presentation tomorrow. You know how it is." Margaret didn't know how it was. David had become increasingly distant over the years, their weekly phone calls dwindling to monthly check-ins, then holiday calls, then silence punctuated only by emergencies like this one. She followed Rebecca through the living room, taking in the cream-colored sectional sofa and the 65-inch television mounted above a gas fireplace. "The kids are at soccer practice," Rebecca said over her shoulder. "Emma's got regionals coming up, and Jake's coach thinks he has real potential. Very demanding schedule." "I'd love to see them play sometime," Margaret offered, shifting her smaller suitcase to her other hand. Rebecca's pause was barely perceptible. "Well, we'll see. Their schedule is pretty packed." They descended a staircase Margaret hadn't noticed, the temperature dropping noticeably as they reached the finished basement. The space was nice enough: beige carpet, a small bathroom, and a window that looked out at ground level. But it felt like a basement, with that subtle dampness and the muffled sounds of the house above. "This is it," Rebecca announced, gesturing toward a twin bed pushed against the far wall. "The guest room. There's a dresser for your things, and you can use the bathroom down the hall." Margaret set down her suitcases and looked around the room that would be her home for the foreseeable future. It was smaller than her old bedroom, but clean and quiet. She could make it work. "I really appreciate this, Rebecca. I know having me here is going to be an adjustment for everyone." "It is," Rebecca agreed bluntly. "But family helps family, right? That's what David says." The emphasis on David's name wasn't lost on Margaret. She understood the message. This was her son's idea, not Rebecca's invitation. "I want to contribute," Margaret said quickly. "I can help with groceries, cleaning, whatever you need. I don't want to be a burden." Rebecca's expression shifted slightly, something calculating flickering in her eyes. "Well, we weren't exactly planning for another person's expenses." Food costs, utilities, the extra laundry. Of course. I get my pension the first of every month. It's not much, but I can help. That's thoughtful, Rebecca said, and for the first time, her smile seemed genuine. We'll figure something out. The sound of the garage door opening echoed through the house, followed by footsteps on the floor above. Rebecca's entire demeanor changed, becoming warmer, more animated. That's David now, she said. I should go start dinner. You get settled. And we'll talk more later. Margaret nodded, listening to Rebecca's quick footsteps on the stairs. She could hear muffled voices above David's tired baritone, and Rebecca's suddenly bright chatter. The words were indistinct, but the tone was clear. Rebecca was performing. Happiness for her husband's benefit. Alone in the basement room, Margaret sat on the edge of the twin bed and looked around at her temporary home. The walls were bare except for a generic landscape print, and the single window offered a view of the foundation plantings. She'd gone from her own apartment, small as it was, to this underground room in her son's house, dependent on the goodwill of a woman who clearly resented her presence. But it was temporary, she reminded herself. She'd raised 3 children as a single mother after her husband's death, worked 2 jobs to keep them fed and clothed, and survived 47 years of adult life. She could handle a few months of awkwardness with Rebecca. Margaret opened her larger suitcase and began unpacking her clothes, hanging them in the small closet. As she worked, she could hear family life resuming above her head, car doors slamming as the children returned from practice, their voices calling out greetings. Rebecca's responses warm and maternal. She wasn't part of that life yet. Maybe she never would be. But she was here, and she was safe, and that had to be enough for now. Margaret woke to the sound of rushed footsteps above her head, and the distant hum of a coffee maker. Her first morning in David's house felt surreal. She'd slept poorly on the unfamiliar mattress, startled awake several times by the house's settling sounds. The basement window showed only a sliver of grey dawn light, filtering through the foundation plantings. By the time she dressed and climbed the stairs, the kitchen was already in full swing. Rebecca moved efficiently between the counter and stove, packing lunch boxes while simultaneously scrambling eggs. Emma and Jake sat at the granite island, still in their pajamas, arguing over the last of the orange juice. "Good morning, Margaret," said softly, not wanting to startle anyone. Rebecca glanced up, her smile tight. "Oh, morning. I didn't expect you to be up so early." "I've always been an early riser," Margaret replied, hovering uncertainly by the kitchen entrance. "Can I help with anything?" "Everything's under control," Rebecca said quickly, then added with pointed emphasis, "We have our routine down pretty well." Margaret watched as Rebecca plated the eggs with practiced efficiency, calling out instructions to the children about homework and after-school activities. David appeared in a rumpled business suit, grabbing his coffee mug and kissing Rebecca's cheek. "Morning, Mom," he said, barely glancing at Margaret. "Sleep okay?" "Fine, thank you. The room is very comfortable." Good. David was already scrolling through his phone, his attention elsewhere. "Big day today. Might be late tonight." Margaret noticed Emma studying her with curious eyes. The 12-year-old had her father's dark hair, but Rebecca's sharp features. "Are you really going to live here now, Grandma?" "Just for a little while, sweetheart, until I find—" "Emma, finish your breakfast," Rebecca interrupted sharply. "You'll miss the bus." The moment of potential connection evaporated. Margaret retreated to the living room, watching through the window as the family completed their morning ritual. David left first, engine roaring as he backed out of the driveway. Rebecca hustled the children to the bus stop, her voice carrying back through the open door as she reminded them about practice schedules and project deadlines. When Rebecca returned, Margaret was waiting in the kitchen, having quietly rinsed the breakfast dishes. "You didn't need to do that," Rebecca said, but her tone was more irritated than grateful. "I wanted to help. I thought maybe I could handle some of the household chores while I'm here." Rebecca's laugh was sharp. "That's sweet, but we have a system. The kids have responsibilities, and I have my own way of doing things. Of course. I just thought, why don't you focus on getting settled? Maybe look into senior housing options. I'm sure there are programs for people in your situation." The dismissal was clear, but Margaret tried one more time. "What about groceries? I could go to the store for you. I do my shopping on Wednesdays." "Same store, same route, same brands. It's efficient." Rebecca began wiping down counters that already looked spotless. "Besides, I have coupons organized by category. It's complicated." Margaret spent the morning unpacking her few belongings, trying to make the basement room feel less temporary. She hung her late husband's photo on the dresser and arranged her books on the small shelf. When she came upstairs for lunch, she found Rebecca on the phone in the living room, speaking in low, urgent tones. "I don't know how long this is going to last," Rebecca was saying. "She acts like she's doing us a favor, but honestly, it's completely disrupting our routine. The kids don't know what to think." Margaret retreated quickly, her cheeks burning. She made herself a sandwich in the kitchen, eating it standing at the counter to avoid being seen as presumptuous about using the dining room. That afternoon, when Emma and Jake returned from school, Margaret was reading in the living room. Jake, 9 years old with his father's gentle eyes, approached her cautiously. "Grandma, do you want to see my rock collection?" "I'd love to," Margaret sighed, setting down her book. But before Jake could continue, Rebecca appeared in the doorway. "Jake, you have homework. And Emma, you need to change for practice." "But Mum, now, please." The children trudged upstairs and Rebecca turned to Margaret. "I know you want to bond with them, but they have very structured after-school time. Homework first, then activities. It's important they stick to their schedule." "I understand," Margaret said quietly. "I didn't mean to interfere. It's just ... They're at crucial ages. Emma's applying for advanced classes next year, and Jake's still adjusting to his new school. Consistency is really important." Margaret nodded, retreating once again to her basement room. She could hear life continuing above her, Rebecca helping with homework, the children practicing piano, dinner preparations beginning. She wasn't part of any of it. That evening, she asked David if she could join the family for dinner. "Of course, Mom," he said, but she caught the look that passed between him and Rebecca. Dinner was awkward. Margaret tried to engage the children in conversation, asking about their interests in school, but Rebecca consistently redirected the discussion to logistics, upcoming appointments, weekend plans, schedule changes. Every time Margaret began to connect with Emma or Jake, Rebecca found a reason to interrupt. "Emma, tell your father about the permission slip for the field trip. Jake, you need to finish your milk. David, don't forget you have that conference call at 8. After dinner, Margaret offered to help clean up, but Rebecca waved her away. "The kids and I have it handled. It's part of their chores." That night, lying in the basement room, Margaret could hear Rebecca's voice drifting down through the heating vents. She was on the phone again, though Margaret couldn't make out the words. The tone was unmistakable, though frustration, complaint, the voice of someone bearing an unwelcome burden. Margaret pulled her blanket up to her chin and stared at the ceiling. She'd been here less than 24 hours, and already she felt like an intruder in her own son's home. Every attempt to help had been rebuffed. Every effort to connect with her grandchildren had been subtly sabotaged. But she had nowhere else to go. Her savings were depleted. Her old apartment was already occupied by new tenants, and her pension wouldn't stretch to cover market rate rent anywhere in the city. She was trapped in this uncomfortable limbo, dependent on the charity of a woman who clearly resented her presence. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to remember better times, when David was young and would crawl into her bed during thunderstorms, when she'd felt needed and valued. Those days seemed very far away now, separated by years of distance and the growing wall of Rebecca's disapproval. Tomorrow would be another day of walking on eggshells, of trying to make herself invisible while still existing in the same space. She would have to find a way to navigate this new reality, to survive in a house where she was tolerated but not truly welcomed. Margaret had been in the house for nearly a week when her pension check arrived. She'd been dreading the first of the month, knowing that her financial reality would become impossible to ignore. The direct deposit notification chimed on her phone as she sat in the basement, reading one of the romance novels she'd brought from her apartment. $1,200, the same amount that had seemed adequate when she'd had her own place, but now felt paltry in the face of her uncertain future. She climbed the stairs to find Rebecca in the kitchen, furiously typing on her laptop while surrounded by scattered bills and statements. The granite countertop was covered with manila folders, each labeled in Rebecca's precise handwriting. Mortgage, credit cards, utilities, kids' activities. Rebecca. Margaret's voice was hesitant. Could we talk for a moment? Rebecca looked up, her expression guarded. I'm pretty busy right now. End of month accounting. That's actually what I wanted to discuss. Margaret sat down across from her daughter-in-law, clasping her hands together. I know having me here is adding to your expenses, and I want to do my part. Oh? Rebecca's fingers stopped moving across the keyboard, her attention suddenly focused. My pension came in today. It's not much, $1,200 a month, but I'd like to contribute to the household. For groceries, utilities, whatever you think is fair. The change in Rebecca's demeanor was immediate and startling. The tight lines around her eyes softened, and she leaned forward with what appeared to be genuine interest. That's very thoughtful of you, Margaret. I mean, we weren't expecting anything, of course, but you're right that an extra person does impact the budget. Margaret felt a flutter of relief. Maybe this was the key to finding her place in the household. How much would be appropriate? I don't want to be a burden. Rebecca's fingers drummed against the counter as she appeared to calculate. Well, let's see. Your share of the groceries would probably be around $200 a month. Then there's the increase in utilities, water, electric, gas. The basement gets cold, so the heating bill will definitely go up. She paused, pulling out a calculator. And there's the wear and tear on the house, extra cleaning supplies, internet usage. Margaret watched as Rebecca's fingers flew across the calculator keys, the numbers growing larger with each addition. I'd say $400 a month would be fair. That covers your share of everything without putting any burden on our family budget. $400. A third of her pension. Margaret's stomach tightened, but she nodded. That seems reasonable. Wonderful. Rebecca's smile was brighter than any expression Margaret had seen from her. Should we say the first of every month? Just to keep things simple? Of course. Margaret pulled out her checkbook, writing out the amount with slightly shaking hands. As she tore off the check, she noticed Rebecca's eyes tracking the movement hungrily. This is so helpful, Rebecca continued, her voice warm with a friendliness that hadn't been there before. David's been under so much stress about the finances lately. This will really take some pressure off. Margaret handed over the check, feeling a mix of hope and apprehension. I just want to pull my weight. You absolutely are. Rebecca folded the check carefully and tucked it into her wallet. And I think this arrangement will work out well for everyone. Over the next few days, Margaret noticed a subtle shift in Rebecca's behavior. She wasn't exactly warm, but the sharp edge of hostility had dulled. Rebecca began including her in conversations about meal planning, and even asked her opinion on laundry detergent brands. When Margaret offered to help with dinner preparation, Rebecca didn't immediately refuse. "You can chop the vegetables," Rebecca said one evening, sliding a cutting board across the counter. "Just make sure they're uniform. The kids are picky about presentation." Margaret felt a small surge of satisfaction as she carefully diced onions and peppers. Finally, she was contributing something beyond just money. But the peace was fragile. When David came home that night, Margaret overheard part of a conversation between him and Rebecca as they got ready for bed. "She gave you how much?" David's voice carried through the ceiling. 400. "I thought it was fair, considering." "Jesus, Becca. That's a third of what she gets. Are you sure that's not too much?" "David, do you have any idea what it costs to feed another person? And the utilities alone?" Rebecca's voice dropped to a whisper, but Margaret caught fragments. ... barely making ends meet ... credit cards maxed out ... need every penny we can get ... Margaret lay in the darkness, processing what she'd heard. She thought her contribution was about fairness, about earning her place in the household. But Rebecca's whispered words suggested something different: desperation, not generosity. The next morning, Rebecca was particularly attentive, asking about Margaret's coffee preferences and whether she'd slept well. When Margaret mentioned she might look for a part-time job to supplement her income, Rebecca's response was swift and decisive. "Oh, you don't want to do that. At your age, it's so hard to find good employment. And the stress of working again after being retired. It's not worth it. You should just focus on settling in here." Margaret noticed how Rebecca's hand moved protectively toward her purse, where the check was presumably still tucked away. The gesture was subtle but telling. "Besides," Rebecca continued, "you're contributing plenty already. More than plenty, really. You're being very generous." As the week progressed, Margaret began to see a pattern. Rebecca would make comments about Margaret's dependency on their family's generosity, usually in front of the children. "Grandma is so lucky we can help her out," she would say. Or "not everyone has family willing to support them like this." But privately, Rebecca had begun treating Margaret's pension contribution as an established fact, even discussing future months as if the arrangement was permanent. When Margaret hesitantly suggested she might only stay another month or two, Rebecca's expression tightened. "Well, we'll see how things go," she said. "It's not like senior housing is readily available. And with your limited income, well, let's just take it 1 month at a time." Margaret began to feel caught in a web she didn't fully understand. She was contributing a significant portion of her income to the household, that she was still treated like a charity case. Rebecca's attitude had improved, but it felt transactional rather than genuine. She was paying for tolerance, not acceptance. That night, as she lay in her basement room listening to the sounds of family life above, Margaret wondered if she'd made a mistake. The money was supposed to buy her a place in the household, but instead, it seemed to have created a new kind of dependency. She was no longer just a temporary guest, she was a source of income that Rebecca had quickly learned to value. The realization left her feeling more trapped than ever. She'd voluntarily become a paying prisoner in her son's home, and she was beginning to suspect that Rebecca had no intention of letting her leave anytime soon. 3 weeks into her stay, Margaret began to notice the subtle changes. They crept in like shadows at twilight, so gradual that she questioned whether she was imagining things, yet undeniable in their cumulative effect. It started with dinner. For the first 2 weeks, Rebecca had set a place for Margaret at the dining room table without comment. But gradually, the timing shifted. Rebecca would call the family to dinner while Margaret was in the basement. And by the time she climbed the stairs, the meal would be nearly finished. "Oh, Margaret," Rebecca would say with false surprise. "I thought you were resting. There's plenty left in the kitchen, just help yourself." Margaret would stand in the doorway, watching her family eat together while she prepared a plate from the cooling leftovers. The children would glance at her occasionally, but Rebecca kept them engaged in conversation about school and activities, their grandmother effectively invisible. "Emma, tell your father about the science fair project. Jake, you need to finish your vegetables before you can have dessert. David, don't forget to sign the permission slip for the field trip." The rhythm of family life continued around Margaret as if she were a ghost haunting the periphery. The exclusion extended beyond meals. Margaret had developed a habit of reading in the living room during the afternoon, enjoying the natural light from the large windows. But Rebecca began making pointed comments about quiet time and family space. "The kids need to be able to spread out their homework," Rebecca would say, even when Emma and Jake were upstairs in their rooms. "And David likes to unwind in here when he gets home from work." Margaret found herself retreating to her basement room earlier each day, the walls feeling more like a prison than a refuge. She tried to understand, after all, it was their house, their routine, their life. She was the intruder, the disruption to their carefully orchestrated existence. Rebecca's comments about Margaret's belongings became more frequent and pointed. "This hallway is so narrow," she would say, maneuvering around Margaret's small suitcase. "Maybe we should find a better place for your things." Margaret's possessions gradually migrated to smaller and smaller spaces. Her books, once welcomed on the living room shelf, were deemed clutter and moved to her bedroom. Her reading glasses, left on the kitchen counter, were relocated to a drawer for safety. Her favorite sweater, hung on the back of a dining room chair, was folded and returned to her dresser with a note about keeping common areas tidy. The criticism of Margaret's appearance began subtly. Rebecca would make casual observations that landed like small cuts. "That dress is so ... vintage," she'd say with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You've had it for a while, haven't you? Your hair looks different today. Maybe a little touch up at the roots. I have some concealer if you want to cover those age spots. It's amazing what good makeup can do." Each comment was delivered with apparent concern, wrapped in the language of helpfulness. But Margaret began to see herself through Rebecca's eyes, outdated, shabby, showing her age in ways that were apparently embarrassing. The stories Margaret tried to share about her past were met with polite disinterest that gradually became open dismissal. When she mentioned her years working as a bank teller, Rebecca would comment, "Oh, that was before everything went digital. So different now." When Margaret talked about raising her children, Rebecca would interject with observations about modern parenting and what we know now about child development. "Things were so much simpler then," Rebecca would say. "Parents didn't have to worry about screen time and organic foods, and all the things we have to consider now." The message was clear. Margaret's experiences were irrelevant, her knowledge outdated, her perspective worthless in the modern world. Emma and Jake began to absorb their mother's attitude. When Margaret tried to help Jake with his math homework, he politely declined, saying his teacher wanted him to use new methods that his grandmother wouldn't understand. When she offered to teach Emma how to knit, the girl wrinkled her nose and said, "That's kind of old-fashioned, isn't it?" Margaret watched her relationship with her grandchildren deteriorate as Rebecca's influence poisoned their perception of her. The children weren't cruel, they were simply learning to see their grandmother as their mother did. Irrelevant, outdated, slightly embarrassing. David remained largely oblivious to the psychological warfare being waged in his home. When Margaret tried to broach the subject during one of their rare moments alone, he dismissed her concerns with the casual cruelty of someone who couldn't be bothered to pay attention. "Mum, Rebecca's just particular about the house. She's not being mean, she's just organized. Maybe try to be more aware of your impact on the household. Your impact." As if she were a natural disaster rather than a human being trying to find her place in her son's life. Margaret began to internalize the criticism. She found herself checking her appearance obsessively, second-guessing every word she spoke, monitoring her impact on the household with increasing anxiety. She bought new clothes with money she couldn't afford, trying to update her wardrobe to meet Rebecca's standards. She colored her hair and invested in expensive makeup, hoping to make herself more acceptable. Nothing worked. Rebecca's criticism evolved to meet Margaret's efforts. The new clothes were trying too hard. The hair color was too harsh. The makeup was caked on. Margaret couldn't win because winning was never the point. The point was to keep her off balance, insecure and dependent. The basement room became her sanctuary and her prison. She spent increasing hours there, emerging only for meals and brief forays to the kitchen or bathroom. She began to question her own perceptions, wondering if she was being too sensitive, too demanding, too present in a house where she was clearly an unwelcome guest. Late at night, she would hear Rebecca's voice drifting down through the heating. Thence phone conversations with friends or family members where Margaret was discussed like a problem to be solved. "I don't know how much longer we can do this. She's so needy. Everything has to revolve around her schedule. The kids are starting to complain." Margaret would lie in the darkness, listening to herself being transformed into a burden, a problem, a source of stress for the family she was paying to live with. The woman on the phone bore no resemblance to the person Margaret knew herself to be, or at least, the person she had once been. She was disappearing, piece by piece, comment by comment, exclusion by exclusion. The strong, independent woman who had raised 3 children and worked 2 jobs was being systematically erased, replaced by the helpless, dependent old woman that Rebecca needed her to be. And the worst part was that Margaret was beginning to believe it herself. By the second month, Rebecca's pretense of politeness had worn thin. The financial arrangement had given her what she wanted, Margaret's pension money, flowing into the household budget, but it had also emboldened her. Margaret was now a paying resident, which somehow, in Rebecca's twisted logic, made her fair game for open criticism. The morning everything shifted. Margaret was in the kitchen making herself tea when Emma rushed in, backpack slung over her shoulder. "Grandma, can you help me with my history report? It's about the 1960s, and Mom said you lived through that." Margaret's face lit up with the first genuine smile she'd worn in weeks. "Of course, sweetheart. I'd love to help. I remember those years very well. Actually, Emma," Rebecca's voice cut through the moment like a blade, "I think we should stick to reliable sources. The internet has much more accurate information than someone's old memories." Emma looked confused. "But Grandma, was there... People remember things differently as they age, honey. Their memories get fuzzy. It's better to use factual sources for schoolwork." Margaret felt the words hit her like a physical blow. She watched Emma's expression change from excitement to uncertainty, then to polite dismissal. "Maybe I'll just use the computer," Emma said quietly, avoiding Margaret's eyes as she left for school. Rebecca busied herself with the coffee maker, humming softly as if nothing had happened. But Margaret caught the small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. That afternoon, Margaret was dusting the living room, one of the few household tasks Rebecca still permitted her to do when Jake came home from school. His shirt was torn, and his knee scraped, evidence of playground adventures. "What happened to you?" Margaret asked, setting down her dustcloth. "Tommy Morrison pushed me during recess. But I'm okay." "Let me clean that scrape for you," Margaret offered, moving toward the kitchen for first aid supplies. "Jake doesn't need help from someone who can barely take care of herself," Rebecca said, appearing in the doorway. She hadn't raised her voice, but her words carried the weight of absolute authority. "Go wash up in your bathroom, Jake. I'll be up to look at it in a minute." Jake glanced between his grandmother and his mother, then trudged upstairs without another word. Margaret stood frozen in the living room, the dustcloth trembling in her hands. "I was just trying to help." "Were you?" Rebecca's voice was deceptively mild. "Or were you trying to play grandmother to children who barely know you?" The cruelty was breathtaking in its casualness. Margaret had been present for both children's births, had visited regularly when they were small, had sent birthday cards and Christmas presents every year. But Rebecca was rewriting history, erasing Margaret's role in their lives. "They're my grandchildren," Margaret said quietly. "They're my children," Rebecca corrected. "And they don't need confusion about who takes care of them in this house." The message was clear. Margaret was not a caregiver. She was not a contributor. She was not family. She was a paying guest who had overstepped her boundaries. The attacks became more frequent and public. At dinner that night, Rebecca began what would become a nightly ritual of subtle humiliation. "Margaret, you might want to sit up straighter. Your posture is terrible. Are you sure you should have that second helping? At your age, metabolism slows down so much. David, did you notice your mother's been leaving her teeth cleaning tablets in the bathroom? So unsanitary." Each comment was delivered with the tone of helpful concern, but the children absorbed every word. Margaret watched as their perception of her shifted from respect, pity to embarrassment. She was becoming the eccentric old relative who couldn't be trusted with basic tasks. Rebecca's campaign extended to Margaret's few remaining possessions. "This cardigan has seen better days," she would say, fingering the soft wool Margaret had worn for years. "Maybe it's time to let go of some of these old things. Your romance novels are taking up so much space. Do you really need all these books? Some of them look positively ancient. I found this photo album in the living room. Family pictures should probably stay in your room. We don't want the kids thinking the house is a museum." Every item that connected Margaret to her past, every possession that gave her comfort, was deemed inappropriate for the shared spaces of the house. She was being systematically erased from the family narrative, her presence minimized to the point of invisibility. The children, influenced by their mother's constant criticism, began to echo Rebecca's sentiments. Emma complained that Margaret's perfume was too strong and old-fashioned. Jake wrinkled his nose when Margaret tried to share stories from her childhood, saying they were boring and from too long ago. David, when he was present at all, seemed to see only what Rebecca wanted him to see. When Margaret tried to discuss her growing discomfort with the living situation, he dismissed her concerns with irritation. "Mum, you're being oversensitive. Rebecca's just trying to help you adjust. Maybe if you made more of an effort to fit in. Fit in, as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be welcomed." The isolation became complete when Rebecca began making comments about Margaret's neediness and attention-seeking behavior in front of visitors. When David's brother called one evening, Rebecca made sure to mention how difficult it was to have a dependent elderly relative in the house. "She needs so much help with basic things," Rebecca said, her voice carrying clearly to where Margaret sat in the basement. "It's like having a third child, really. Someone who can't quite manage on their own." Margaret listened to herself being described as a burden, a problem. a source of stress for the family she was financially supporting. The woman on the phone bore no resemblance to the person she knew herself to be, or at least, the person she had once been. She was disappearing, not just from the physical spaces of the house, but from her own sense of self. Rebecca's relentless criticism had created a new reality where Margaret was useless, outdated, and fundamentally flawed. The strong, capable woman who had raised 3 children and managed her own life for 67 years was being systematically replaced by the helpless, dependent old woman that Rebecca needed her to be. And Margaret was beginning to believe it was true. She would catch herself in the mirror and see what Rebecca saw: age spots, wrinkles, the physical evidence of a life lived. She would hear herself speak and wonder if her words really were irrelevant, her stories truly boring, her presence genuinely unwanted. The worst part was the growing certainty that Rebecca was right. Maybe she was useless. Maybe she was just taking up space. Maybe, without her pension check, she really would be nothing at all. The thought terrified her because, deep down, she was beginning to believe it might be true. The morning of what would become the worst day of Margaret's stay began with an unusual silence. Rebecca had taken the children to early dentist appointments, leaving Margaret alone in the house for the first time in weeks. The quiet felt both liberating and unsettling. She'd grown accustomed to the constant tension of navigating around Rebecca's moods and criticism. Margaret stood in the kitchen, savoring her coffee without the usual undercurrent of disapproval. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like to exist without judgment, to move through a space without constantly measuring her impact on others. The tranquility was deceptive. In her eagerness to contribute something meaningful to the household, Margaret decided to tackle the one area Rebecca had deemed off-limits: the formal living room. It was a pristine space that seemed to exist more for show than comfort, with its white furniture and carefully arranged decorative objects. Rebecca had made it clear that this room was for special occasions only, but Margaret reasoned that a thorough cleaning would be a welcome surprise. She began dusting the mahogany side tables, working carefully around Rebecca's collection of crystal figurines and expensive vases. The room felt like a museum, each piece positioned with mathematical precision. Margaret understood why Rebecca was protective of this space. It represented something aspirational, a vision of the life she wanted to project. The accident happened in an instant. Margaret was reaching across the coffee table to dust the lamp, when her sleeve caught the edge of Rebecca's most prized possession: a delicate Waterford crystal vase that had been a wedding gift from David's wealthy aunt. The vase toppled, seeming to fall in slow motion before shattering against the marble floor, with a sound like breaking dreams. Margaret stared at the scattered pieces, her heart hammering against her ribs. The vase hadn't just been expensive, it had been irreplaceable, a symbol of Rebecca's connection to David's more affluent relatives. She dropped to her knees, trying frantically to gather the larger pieces, as if she could somehow reassemble the destruction. The sound of the garage door opening sent panic shooting through her chest. They were home early. "Mum, I told you we'd be back by..." David's voice cut off as he entered the living room and saw Margaret kneeling among the crystal shards, her hands shaking as she tried to collect the pieces. "What happened?" His voice was quiet, but Margaret could hear the dread beneath the calm. "I was just trying to clean, and you broke my vase." Rebecca's voice came from the doorway, flat and deadly. She stood perfectly still, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and something that looked almost like satisfaction. "You broke my Waterford crystal vase. I'm so sorry, Rebecca. I'll replace it, I promise. I'll use my pension money." "Replace it?" Rebecca's laugh was sharp and bitter. "That was a wedding gift. It's irreplaceable." Do you have any idea what that was worth? Margaret's mouth went dry. She could see the price in Rebecca's eyes, not just the monetary value, but the symbolic weight of the object. This wasn't just about Crystal. It was about boundaries, about Margaret's fundamental inability to exist in this house without causing damage. "I'll find a way to make it right," Margaret whispered. "How?" Rebecca's voice was rising now, her composure cracking. "How exactly will you make this right? With what money? You can barely afford to support yourself. And now you're destroying our belongings." David stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Mom, I told you to be careful. I specifically said you needed to watch your impact on the household. I was trying to help." "Help?" Rebecca's voice cracked like a whip. "You call this helping? You can't even clean a room without breaking something valuable. What exactly are you good for?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Margaret felt something inside her chest begin to collapse. A foundation that had been weakening for months finally giving way. "I'm sorry," she repeated, the words feeling hollow and useless. "Sorry doesn't fix my vase," Rebecca said, her voice gaining strength from Margaret's obvious distress. "Sorry doesn't undo the damage. Sorry doesn't make you less of a walking disaster." Emma and Jake appeared in the doorway, drawn by their mother's raised voice. Margaret saw herself through their eyes, a clumsy old woman kneeling in a pile of broken glass, the cause of their mother's obvious distress. "What did Grandma do?" Emma asked, her voice small. "She broke my wedding vase," Rebecca said, her tone now carrying the weight of martyrdom. "The one from Great-Aunt Helen. The one I told everyone to be careful around." Margaret watched as the children's expressions shifted from curiosity to disappointment. She had become the family cautionary tale, the reason why nice things couldn't be trusted around certain people. "I'll pay for it," Margaret said again, though she had no idea how she would manage such an expense. "I'll find a way." "With what money?" Rebecca's voice was relentless now, each word calculated to inflict maximum damage. "Your pension? The money you can barely live on? The money we depend on to help support you?" The truth was laid bare. Margaret's financial contribution wasn't generous, it was essential. She wasn't helping the family. She was barely covering her own costs. And now she had destroyed something worth more than she could afford. "Maybe I should start looking for other arrangements," Margaret said quietly. "Good luck with that," Rebecca replied, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "With your limited income and your track record, I'm sure you'll find plenty of options." The sarcasm was devastating because it was true. Margaret's savings were gone. Her pension was already committed to this household, and her age made her an undesirable tenant anywhere else. She was trapped, dependent on the goodwill of a woman who clearly despised her. David cleared his throat, uncomfortably. Let's clean this up and figure out what to do." But Margaret could see in his eyes that he blamed her too. She had disrupted his marriage, upset his wife, and now destroyed their belongings. She was the problem that needed to be managed, not the mother who deserved his protection. As she carefully picked up the crystal shards, Margaret felt each piece cutting into her hands like the sharp edges of her shattered dignity. She had tried so hard to earn her place in this house, to prove her worth, to justify her existence. Instead, she had only confirmed Rebecca's assessment of her as a burden, a liability, a source of chaos and expense. The broken vase became a metaphor for everything Margaret had lost. Not just her independence and her home, but her sense of self-worth. She was a woman who broke things, who couldn't be trusted, who cost more than she contributed. The worst part was that Rebecca wasn't finished with her. Margaret could see it in her daughter-in-law's eyes, the calculation and satisfaction of someone who had finally been given the weapon she needed. The broken vase would be the excuse for everything that came next. Margaret gathered the last of the crystal pieces, her hands bleeding from the sharp edges, and wondered if she had finally given Rebecca the justification she'd been waiting for to deliver the killing blow to whatever remained of Margaret's battered self-respect. The stage was set for the confrontation that would either destroy her completely or force her to remember who she used to be. The afternoon stretched endlessly after the vase incident. Margaret had retreated to her basement room, nursing her cut hands and the deeper wounds to her pride. The bandages Rebecca had grudgingly provided were wrapped too tightly, cutting off circulation, but Margaret didn't dare ask for help adjusting them. She sat on her narrow bed, staring at the wall and listening to the sounds of normal family life continuing above her head. Rebecca's voice carried through the house like a storm system, punctuated by the children's responses and David's occasional murmur of agreement. Margaret caught fragments of phone calls, Rebecca recounting the incident to what sounded like her sister, her voice taking on the tone of someone recounting a natural disaster. You should have seen the mess. Crystal everywhere. At her age, you'd think she'd be more careful. I don't know how much more of this I can take. Each overheard word was a needle finding its mark. Margaret pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and tried to read, but the words blurred together on the page. The walls of her small room seemed to be closing in, the ceiling pressing down with the weight of her shame. Dinner came and went without an invitation. Margaret remained in her room, her stomach growling but her appetite non-existent. She could hear the family eating together, their conversation carefully normal, as if nothing had happened. As if she didn't exist. It was nearly 9 o'clock when Rebecca finally came downstairs. Margaret heard her footsteps on the basement stairs, measured, deliberate, like a judge approaching the bench. The knock on her door was sharp and businesslike. Margaret? We need to talk. Margaret opened the door to find Rebecca standing in the hallway, her arms crossed, her expression a mask of cold fury that had been building all day. Behind her, at the top of the stairs, Margaret could see David's silhouette. He was listening, but he wouldn't come down. He wouldn't involve himself in whatever was about to happen. I've been thinking about today, Rebecca began, her voice deceptively calm. About the vase, about this whole situation, about everything that's happened since you moved in here. Margaret nodded, waiting for the bill, the ultimatum, the consequences of her clumsiness. I've tried to be patient, Rebecca continued. I've tried to be understanding, but I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend that this arrangement is working. Rebecca, I know today was terrible, but today was just the final straw. Rebecca's voice was gaining strength, feeding off Margaret's obvious distress. You broke my most precious possession. Something irreplaceable. Something that meant everything to me. I'll find a way to pay for it. With what money? Rebecca's laugh was harsh and cutting. You don't have any money. You don't have anything of value. You don't have any skills, any purpose, any reason to exist except for that government check that comes every month. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She felt her knees weaken, her breath catch in her throat. That's not true, she whispered. Isn't it? Rebecca stepped closer, her voice rising. What exactly do you contribute to this household besides your pension? What value do you add? What purpose do you serve? Margaret opened her mouth, but no. Words came. 3 months of systematic degradation had done their work. She couldn't think of an answer, because Rebecca had systematically dismantled every possibility. You can't cook, I do all the cooking. You can't clean, you just break things. You can't help with the children, you confuse them with your outdated ideas. You can't maintain the house, you're a walking disaster. You can't even take care of yourself properly. Each word was precisely chosen, calculated to destroy. Margaret felt herself shrinking, disappearing under the weight of Rebecca's assault. "So tell me," Rebecca continued, her voice now at full volume, "what exactly are you good for? What is your purpose? What reason do you have to exist in this world? I raised my children. I worked. I contributed to society. That was decades ago." Rebecca's voice cracked like a whip. "What have you done lately? What have you accomplished? What mark have you made?" Margaret's mind went blank. The woman who had once managed a household, raised 3 children, and worked 2 jobs seemed like a stranger from another lifetime. That person had been confident, capable, necessary. This person, the one standing in a basement room being screamed at by her daughter-in-law, was none of those things. "Without your pension, you'd be nothing," Rebecca screamed, her voice echoing off the basement walls. "You're just a useless old woman who can't even take care of herself. You have no value, no purpose, no reason to exist except for that government check." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Margaret felt something inside her chest crack and break, more devastating than the crystal vase upstairs. "You're a burden," Rebecca continued, her voice now deadly quiet. "A liability. A problem that needs to be solved. You take up space, use up resources, and give nothing back. Nothing." Margaret couldn't breathe. The walls of the basement seemed to be closing in, the ceiling pressing down. She was disappearing, being erased by the relentless force of Rebecca's hatred. "I supported David through college," she said weakly. "I helped him become who he is. And what thanks do you get for that? You're living in his basement, dependent on his charity, breaking his wife's possessions. Some legacy." The cruelty was breathtaking. Margaret had sacrificed everything for her children, her career, her savings, her future, and now it was being used as evidence of her worthlessness. "I have grandchildren," Margaret whispered. "Emma and Jake are embarrassed by you," Rebecca finished. "They see what you are, a pathetic old woman who can't function in the modern world. They don't want your stories, your advice, your outdated perspective. They want you to disappear." Margaret sank down onto her bed, her legs finally giving out. The assault was complete, devastating, designed to destroy whatever remained of her self-worth. "So here's what's going to happen," Rebecca said, standing over her like a conquering general. "You're going to continue paying your $400 a month. You're going to stay in this room and stop pretending you're part of this family. You're going to accept that you're nothing without that pension check, and you're going to be grateful that we're willing to tolerate your existence." Margaret looked up at her daughter-in-law through tears she didn't remember shedding. "Why are you doing this to me?" "Because someone needs to tell you the truth," Rebecca said coldly. "You're not a beloved grandmother. You're not a valued family member. You're a source of income and a source of problems. That's all you are, and that's all you'll ever be." With that, Rebecca turned and walked up the stairs, leaving Margaret alone in the basement with the wreckage of her self-respect. She could hear voices upstairs, Rebecca's triumphant tone, David's murmured responses, the children's questions being hushed away. Margaret sat in the darkness, Rebecca's words echoing in her mind like a curse. "Without your pension, you'd be nothing, a useless old woman. No value, no purpose, no reason to exist." For the first time in her life, Margaret believed it might be true. She was nothing. She had always been nothing. And now, finally, someone had been brave enough to tell her. Margaret lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling as the house settled into its nighttime rhythm. The luminous numbers on her alarm clock read 1:47 a.m., but sleep remained elusive. Rebecca's words echoed in her mind like a broken record. Without your pension, you'd be nothing. The phrase had burrowed deep into her consciousness, poisoning every attempt at rest. Her throat felt raw from crying, though she tried to muffle her sobs in her pillow. The last thing she wanted was to give Rebecca the satisfaction of knowing how completely her words had destroyed what remained of Margaret's dignity. She'd spent hours replaying the confrontation, searching for some defense, some argument that might prove Rebecca wrong. But every angle she examined seemed to confirm her daughter-in-law's brutal assessment. Margaret was useless. She was a burden. She was nothing without that monthly government check. The house above her had been quiet for hours, but Margaret's mind refused to quiet with it. She kept thinking about the vase, about David's disappointed face, about the way Emma and Jake had looked at her with a mixture of pity and embarrassment. Even her own grandchildren saw her as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. At 2:15 a.m., Margaret finally gave up on sleep. Her mouth was dry, her head pounding from dehydration and emotional exhaustion. She needed water, aspirin, something to dull the sharp edges of her despair. Moving quietly, she slipped on her robe and crept up the basement stairs, careful to avoid the creaky third step. The house was dark except for the soft glow of the digital clocks and the security system panel. Margaret made her way to the kitchen, navigating by the pale moonlight filtering through the windows. She filled a glass with water and stood at the sink, looking out at the backyard where everything appeared peaceful and normal. That's when she heard Rebecca's voice. At first, Margaret thought she was imagining it, a phantom echo of the evenings. Cruelty. But as she listened more carefully, she could make out actual words coming from the living room. Rebecca was on the phone, her voice low but carrying in the quiet house. I know it's late, but I couldn't sleep. I keep thinking about what happened today. Margaret froze, her glass halfway to her lips. She should go back downstairs, should respect Rebecca's privacy. But something in her daughter-in-law's tone held her in place, a quality she'd never heard before. Rebecca sounded vulnerable. I feel terrible about what I said to her, Rebecca continued. I know I went too far, but I was just so angry about the vase, and the stress of everything else. Margaret's heart began to race. An apology? After months of cruelty, was Rebecca actually expressing remorse? No, Sarah, you don't understand, Rebecca said, and Margaret realized she was talking to her sister. I can't afford to be nice to her. I can't let her get comfortable here because we need that money too much. The words hit Margaret like ice water. She pressed herself against the kitchen wall, straining to hear more. The mortgage is 3 months behind, Rebecca continued, her voice thick with desperation. We're maxed out on every credit card. David's company is talking about layoffs, and Emma needs orthodontic work that insurance won't cover. Without Margaret's pension money, we'd lose the house. Margaret's glass slipped from her numb fingers, but she caught it before it could crash to the floor. Her hands were shaking as the full scope of Rebecca's deception began to unfold. I know it sounds horrible, Rebecca was saying, but I have to keep her feeling desperate and worthless. If she realizes we need her more than she needs us, she might stop contributing to the household expenses. Or worse, she might leave and take that money with her. Margaret felt the world tilt sideways. The basement room, the isolation, the constant criticism, it had all been calculated. Rebecca hadn't been trying to drive her away. She'd been trying to break her spirit just enough to keep her trapped and paying. $400 a month might not sound like much to you, Rebecca continued. But it's the difference between keeping this house and losing everything. It's covering the minimum payments on our debt. It's keeping us from complete financial ruin. Margaret's mind raced, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Rebecca's sudden interest when she'd first mentioned her pension. The way financial discussions always ended with Margaret contributing more. The systematic destruction of her self-worth designed to make her feel like she had no other options. "I hate myself for what I'm doing to her," Rebecca said. And for the first time, she sounded genuinely anguished. "She's not a bad person. She's just old and lonely and trying to find her place in the world. But I have to protect my family first. I have to think about Emma and Jake's future." Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Rebecca's cruelty hadn't been born of pure malice. It had been born of desperation. The woman who had seemed so confident and superior was actually terrified, clinging to Margaret's pension like a lifeline. "The worst part is that David doesn't know how bad our finances are," Rebecca continued. "He thinks his salary is enough, that we're just being careful with money. He has no idea we're about to lose everything. I can't tell him because he'd blame himself, and the stress would probably cost him his job." Margaret understood now why David had been so absent, so dismissive of her concerns. He wasn't complicit in Rebecca's cruelty. He was completely unaware of it. Rebecca had been conducting her campaign of psychological warfare in secret, timing her attacks for when David was at work or distracted. "I know what you're thinking," Rebecca said into the phone. "But what choice do I have? We can't qualify for another loan. We can't refinance with David's credit score. We can't declare bankruptcy because of his job. Margaret's pension is literally the only thing standing between us and foreclosure." Margaret sank into a kitchen chair, her legs no longer able to support her. The woman who had spent months telling her she was worthless, useless, and unwanted had been lying. Rebecca needed her, desperately. "I've created a monster," Rebecca continued, her voice breaking. "I've turned into someone I don't recognize. I'm emotionally abusing an elderly woman to keep my family afloat. What kind of person does that make me?" The question hung in the air, and Margaret found herself feeling an unexpected stab of sympathy. For her tormentor, Rebecca was trapped too, caught between her family's needs and her own moral compass. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," Rebecca said. "Every time I look at her, I see what I've done. I see this strong woman who raised 3 children by herself, who worked 2 jobs to put food on the table, who survived losing her husband and her home. And I've convinced her she's nothing." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of despair. Rebecca's words had inadvertently reminded her of who she really was, not the broken, dependent woman she'd been made to feel like, but the survivor who had overcome every obstacle life had thrown at her. "The truth is," Rebecca said quietly, "Margaret is probably stronger than all of us. She's been through things we can't imagine, and she's still standing. But I've been systematically destroying her spirit because I'm too much of a coward to find another solution to our problems." Margaret sat in the darkness, absorbing the truth of her situation. She wasn't the problem, she was the solution. She wasn't the burden, she was the lifeline. She wasn't worthless, she was essential. Rebecca's confession continued, but Margaret had heard enough. She rose from the chair and made her way back to the basement, her movements now steady and purposeful. The broken woman who had descended these stairs hours earlier was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the game that had been played at her expense. For the first time in months, Margaret fell asleep quickly, and when she woke the next morning, she woke with a plan. Margaret awoke before sunrise, but something was different. The heaviness in her chest was still there. Yes, but not the same. It didn't suffocate her. It sat beside her like an old coat she could choose whether or not to wear. For the first time in weeks, she didn't reach for it immediately. The events of the previous night, replayed in fragments, Rebecca's late-night confession, the desperate edge in her voice, The quiet acknowledgement that Margaret had been deliberately broken not out of cruelty alone, but out of necessity. It didn't excuse what had been done to her, but it shifted the shape of her pain. Rebecca needed her. That truth glowed faintly at the edges of her self-loathing, like a match struck in the dark. Not because Margaret was loved or respected, but because she was useful. Her pension, her silence, her dwindling self-worth had become essential to Rebecca's illusion of control. And if Margaret was useful, then perhaps she wasn't worthless after all. She rose slowly, wrapping her cardigan around her shoulders, and brushing her fingers through her greying curls. She skipped the makeup. There was no longer anyone she needed to impress in the mirror. She looked older than she remembered, but not erased. Her eyes were tired, yes, but they were still her own. Downstairs in the kitchen, she boiled water for tea. She didn't tiptoe. The kettle hissed as it always had, and the clink of her cup against the saucer sounded louder in the morning quiet. Rebecca didn't appear, but Margaret wasn't surprised. She imagined her daughter-in-law asleep upstairs, curled beside David, unaware that the woman she'd spent months dismantling had overheard everything and remembered herself. Margaret sat at the table and opened a small notepad she hadn't touched in months. She made a list. Contact Dorothy, look up senior housing calls, social services, pension, cancel check. Ask advisor, find storage unit. Each line steadied her. These weren't dreams. They were preparations. At 8:30. David came downstairs in a rush, briefcase in one hand, necktie askew. Margaret greeted him with a calm "Good morning," which he returned distractedly while adjusting his collar. "I'll be late tonight," he muttered, already scrolling through emails. "Rebecca said you were, settling in, okay?" "I'm finding my rhythm," Margaret replied. He didn't notice the difference in her tone. When he left, she took her tea back down to the basement. It no longer felt like a tomb. It felt, oddly, like a war room somewhere quiet, removed, where she could plan. She retrieved the folder of her financial documents and began sorting. Pension stubs, social security statements, old pay records, bank balances. Rebecca had never asked for full transparency, but she'd taken enough to feel entitled to control. That would stop today. Margaret spent the next hour on the phone. First with Dorothy, who answered with surprise and joy in her voice. "Margaret?" she said, breathless. "Is everything all right?" "I think," Margaret said. "I'm remembering who I am. I'd like to visit sometime. Soon." Dorothy hesitated only briefly. "I'd like that very much. You're always welcome here." Next, she called the Senior Resource Center downtown. A patient voice walked her through housing options, wait lists, and eligibility requirements. There were government-funded complexes for low-income seniors. Some had 6-month waits. Others might open in weeks. Margaret took notes. "Do you have a safe place to stay right now?" the woman asked gently. "I do," Margaret replied. "But not a place where I'm free." By lunch, she'd compiled a list of apartment leads and bookmarked the phone number for a legal aid group specializing in elder financial abuse. Just in case, the day passed quietly. Rebecca was cool but cordial, perhaps embarrassed, perhaps simply exhausted from her own performance. She didn't mention the vase or the pension. She barely looked at Margaret at all. That evening, Margaret did something she hadn't done in over a month. She sat with Jake in the family room. He was watching a nature documentary, his legs tucked under him on the couch. Margaret sat beside him without asking. For a moment, he tensed, then he glanced at her and offered a small smile. "They said some butterflies migrate 2,000 miles, he said. "Even the tiny ones." Margaret smiled back. "Sometimes the smallest things go the furthest." They sat in silence after that. watching the flutter of orange wings across a blue sky. Rebecca came downstairs, saw them together, and paused in the doorway. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but Margaret didn't flinch. She held her grandson's gaze a moment longer, then turned back to the screen. Rebecca said nothing. She left without a word. That night, Margaret returned to her basement not defeated, but resolute. She'd made no announcements, no speeches, that she'd taken the first step toward freedom. She didn't need Rebecca to tell her who she was. Any more. She remembered. Margaret rose the next morning with quiet intention. She no longer lingered in bed, steeling herself for another day of navigating Rebecca's moods. The dread hadn't vanished, but it no longer ruled her. There was something else beneath it now. A current of quiet defiance that warmed her from within like the first rays of spring sunlight on cold skin. She made her tea, dressed, and began her day without apology. When Rebecca breezed into the kitchen mid-morning, dressed in workout gear and scrolling through her phone, Margaret simply looked up from her crossword and nodded. "Morning," she said. Rebecca gave her a perfunctory glance. "You're up early." "I always have been." Rebecca hesitated, clearly unsettled by the lack of apology, of deference. "Well, I'm heading out to Pilates. The grocery list is on the counter if you want to pick up a few things later." Margaret took a sip of her tea and didn't look at the list. "I won't be going today. I've made other plans." Rebecca blinked, thrown for just a moment. "Other plans?" "Just a few errands of my own." "Oh." Rebecca's voice sharpened slightly. "Well, let me know if you need gas money, or—" "I won't. Thank you." Margaret smiled, gently but without invitation. Rebecca left in silence, clearly rattled, and Margaret calmly, deliberately took the grocery list and dropped it into the recycling bin. Her first stop was the social services office. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant and tired air, but the woman behind the desk was kind and thorough. Margaret learned she could be eligible for subsidized senior housing within 6 to 12 weeks, maybe sooner, given her income bracket and current living situation. "Do you feel safe in your current home?" the woman asked. "Yes," Margaret answered truthfully. "But not respected." That answer was enough. She left with forms, pamphlets, and a referral to a senior legal aid clinic that specialized in financial exploitation. The folder sat light in her lap as she rode the bus back across town, but it felt like armor. By the time she returned home, Rebecca was gone again. Another class, another errand, another day of spinning a life that now depended on a woman she'd tried to erase. Margaret didn't go to the basement. She sat in the family room, where the afternoon sun lit the furniture in golden angles, and pulled out her knitting. Emma came through the door first. She paused in surprise at the sight of her grandmother on the couch, needles clicking quietly in her hands. "You knit?" "I do. I used to make sweaters for your father. He wore them until the elbows gave out." Emma dropped her backpack by the stairs. "What are you making?" "A scarf. For now." Margaret held it out. "Would you like to learn?" Emma hesitated, then glanced toward the front door. "Mum doesn't like messes. Then we'll be tidy." After a pause, the girl sat beside her. "Just a few minutes," she said. Margaret smiled. "A few minutes is plenty." They sat like that until Rebecca returned, her expression faltering, for a split second before she masked it with a bright smile. "How was school, Emma?" "Fine." Emma handed back the needles, quieter now, but not embarrassed. Rebecca narrowed her eyes but said nothing. Not yet. The next morning, Margaret opened her banking app and stopped her automatic check payment. She didn't announce it. She didn't explain. She simply acted. When the first of the month came and went without a check in Rebecca's hand, Margaret knew the silence upstairs was not ordinary. It was calculated. She imagined Rebecca pacing the kitchen, debating whether to confront her and risk sounding greedy or wait and hope it was a clerical error. The following day, Rebecca tried. Diplomacy. You know, she began over breakfast, stirring her coffee too hard. I think we need to revisit our arrangement. The household budget's gotten a little tight again. I understand, Margaret said, buttering her toast. We all have to adjust sometimes. Rebecca stared at her. Right. So ... Would you be able to? I've decided to redirect my pension toward future housing, Margaret said calmly. I'll be moving out in a few weeks. The silence that followed was absolute. Rebecca's face remained composed, but her knuckles whitened around the mug. Where exactly are you moving to? I have options, Margaret replied. That's surprising, given your situation. Not everything about me is as limited as you assumed. Rebecca rose from the table. Well, I hope that works. Out for you. I'm sure it will. Later that week, Margaret met with Dorothy at a quiet cafe near the library. They hugged for a long moment, and Margaret nearly cried at the simple feeling of arms around her that held no judgment. Look different, Dorothy said. Lighter. I remembered who I am, Margaret said. They sat and talked for 2 hours about senior housing, lawyers, boundaries, and life. When Margaret hesitated over whether to accept a short-term stay at Dorothy's house once she left David's, her friend shook her head gently. You've been surviving. Let someone hold the net for a little while. Margaret nodded. Just for a little while. Rebecca's behavior shifted again. Not cruel yet, but edged with urgency. She suggested meal planning as a family, offered Margaret more structured roles in the household. Margaret declined them all, with kindness, with clarity, with a boundary. She spent more time outdoors walking the neighborhood, speaking to neighbors, sitting in the park with a book. Once she saw Rebecca drive past and do a double take. As if surprised she existed beyond the basement. Jake came to her room that night with a small, hand-drawn card. I made you this, he said shyly. It's a butterfly. Because they fly. Far even when they're little. Margaret took it with trembling hands. Thank you, sweetheart. She didn't know what Rebecca had said, or not said. That something had shifted in the children too. They no longer looked at her as an obligation. They looked at her as a person. That night, in bed, Margaret stared at the ceiling and let the quiet surround her. Not like a prison, but like a clearing. She was still here. And she was no longer afraid. The following week brought something Margaret hadn't expected. Company. It started with a knock at the door just after lunch, a sharp, confident rhythm that didn't belong to Rebecca or one of the children. Margaret set down her tea and crossed the living room cautiously, unsure who would visit unannounced in a neighborhood where everything seemed scheduled. When she opened the door, her breath caught. Uncle Michael? She said, blinking. David's younger brother grinned, his face lined from years of sun and laughter. He was 10 years Margaret's junior, with a warm demeanor and a reputation for showing up unexpectedly throughout the family's history, usually when people least wanted him and most needed him. Hey, Margaret, he said, stepping inside and wrapping her in a firm hug. Heard you were living in a dungeon these days. Figured I'd come see for myself. Margaret chuckled, startled by the affection. It's not quite that dramatic. We'll see, he said with a wink. Rebecca appeared in the hallway, like a thundercloud in Lululemon. Oh, she said, plastering on a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Michael, what a surprise. Always is, he said cheerfully, walking past her into the kitchen. Didn't even have to call ahead. Just felt like catching up with my favorite sister-in-law. That would be Margaret, Rebecca said, not missing a beat. Michael turned to Margaret, completely ignoring Rebecca's passive aggression. You got coffee? Or has this house outlawed caffeine in favor of kombucha and kale? Margaret laughed, really laughed for the first time. In weeks, I'll put on a pot. Rebecca's lips thinned, but she retreated as Margaret brewed the coffee. Michael leaned against the counter. You look tired, he said softly. I am, she admitted, but I'm getting stronger. I figured something wasn't right, he said. David's been weird in our calls, and Becca, well, she's never been subtle. What's really going on here? Margaret hesitated. She wasn't sure how much she wanted to say. But something in Michael's expression, his frankness, his refusal to look away loosened something in her. I've been paying them $400 a month from my pension, she said quietly, just for the privilege of staying in the basement. Rebecca calls it contributing, but it's more like being held hostage. Michael's eyes darkened. He let you pay. He doesn't know everything. Not really. She makes sure he's always half-informed. He shook his head, jaw tightening. She's always been calculated, but this is low. You're his mother. Margaret passed him a cup of coffee. I was. Now I'm a line item in their budget. Michael sat across from her at the table. You're not staying here. Not like this. What do you need? I'm leaving soon. I've applied for housing. I have people helping me. Dorothy, a woman, at the resource center. Even Jake and Emma have started to see things more clearly. Michael smiled. Good. But if you need anything, money, a place to stay, a ride to Canada, I'm a phone call away. Margaret laughed again, the sound lighter now. Thank you, Michael. Don't thank me. I'm just doing what David should have done months ago. That evening, Margaret sat with Emma in the backyard, the warm glow of sunset softening the edges of the house that had once felt like a prison. They were seated on a low bench beneath the dogwood tree, Emma's school papers spread between them. Do you think I should write about Grandma Helen, or pick someone more famous? Emma asked, chewing on the end of her pencil. Why not both? Margaret said. You can talk about how famous people make history, but real people carry it. Emma tilted her head. That sounds like something a teacher would say. Margaret smiled. Maybe I missed my calling. There was a pause. Then Emma looked up at her, eyes thoughtful. Mum said you're leaving. Margaret's heart skipped. Did she? She said you'd found a solution. Emma made finger quotes. She didn't sound happy. I'm not leaving. Because I don't love you, Margaret said carefully. I'm leaving because sometimes grown-ups need to choose peace over permission. Emma looked down at her paper. Will I still see you? If you want to. I do, she said quickly. Then softer, I do want to. Margaret reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her granddaughter's ear. Then you will. They sat in silence after that, the breeze carrying the faint sound of children playing down the street. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself to imagine a future where Emma and Jake might visit her somewhere, she could breathe somewhere. She didn't have to apologize for taking up space. A few days later, as Margaret walked home from a meeting at the senior center, she was stopped by a woman near the library handing out pamphlets about elder advocacy and local resources. You look familiar, the woman said. Did I see you at the community luncheon last month? I wasn't there, but I've been attending housing workshops. The woman extended a hand. I'm Nadia. I work with seniors who've experienced financial abuse. You wouldn't believe how common it is. Margaret accepted the handshake. I might. They spoke for 20 minutes on the library steps about power, dependency, and the slow burn of emotional coercion that so often went unnoticed until it was too late. Welcome to attend one of our support circles, Nadia said. No pressure. Just space to talk or not talk. Margaret took the flyer, folded it neatly into her bag. I think I'd like that. That night, Margaret received a text from Dorothy with an attached photo. A freshly made-up guest room. Soft. Yellow comforter, and a note on the pillow that read, "Welcome home, whenever you're ready." Margaret stared at the image for a long time. Then she replied, "Soon. Very soon." And for the first time since she'd stepped onto David's porch, suitcases in hand and pride in her throat, Margaret felt the weight of power return to her chest. Not anger. Not revenge. Clarity. She hadn't come here to fight. But she would leave here whole. The silence that followed. Margaret's missed pension payments stretched for 3 tense days. It wasn't the usual chill that coated the air when Rebecca was displeased. This was different, heavier, watchful. Like the stillness before a storm. Margaret felt it in the stiffness of Rebecca's movements, in the way she hovered near the mail, opened bank statements with tight lips, and checked her phone more often than usual. The air in the house had changed. Margaret had changed. On the 4th morning, it broke. Rebecca cornered her in the kitchen, the island between them littered with unopened envelopes and a calculator blinking ERROR. "We need to talk," Rebecca said, arms crossed so tightly. They trembled. Margaret calmly placed her tea on the counter. "All right. It's the 7th. The pension didn't come. You always pay by the 5th. "I did notice that," Margaret said mildly. "I've redirected it." Rebecca blinked. "Redirected? To my personal account. I've chosen to stop contributing." "Why?" "Because I'm no longer comfortable subsidizing a household that treats me like an obligation." Rebecca's mouth opened, but Margaret continued before she could interject. "I've been paying rent without rights, supporting a family that barely tolerates me, and I'm done." "You can't just stop," Rebecca snapped. "We have a system." "No," Margaret corrected gently. "You had a system. I was part of it. But I've stepped away." Rebecca's face flushed with rage. "We're relying on that money, Margaret. You're being selfish." Margaret tilted her head. "You've called me a burden for months. But now that the money's gone, suddenly I'm essential." The accusation hung in the air, too loud for Rebecca to swat away. She stared at Margaret, calculating her next move. "You think you're punishing me," she said tightly. "But you're only hurting yourself. You have nowhere to go." Margaret smiled. "I do, actually." She reached into her bag and handed Rebecca a simple typed letter. Notice of departure. Effective 2 weeks. Rebecca's eyes scanned it, her lips thinning with every line. "You're moving out?" she said, incredulous. "Where?" "With Dorothy for now. Then into subsidized housing. It's already in progress." Rebecca shook her head. "You'll regret this. Do you know how expensive it is to live on your own at your age? Less expensive than losing my dignity." Rebecca flinched just slightly. "And what about David? What will you tell him?" "The truth." That evening, David came home to find Margaret seated calmly at the kitchen table, a folder of documents spread before her. Rebecca hovered nearby, her expression brittle. "Mom?" David asked, confusion flickering across his face. "I need a few minutes of your time," Margaret said. "Alone." Rebecca bristled, but David raised a hand. "It's fine, Becca. I'll talk to her." She left with the reluctance of someone stepping away from a bomb she hadn't finished wiring. Margaret gestured to the seat across from her. David sat, glancing uneasily at the papers. "I'm leaving," she said without preamble. "In 2 weeks." He blinked. "What? Why?" "I thought things had settled down." "They have. For me." David rubbed the back of his neck. "Is this about the vase?" "Mum, that was an accident." Rebecca gets worked up. "But she didn't mean." "This isn't about a vase," Margaret interrupted. It's about months of isolation, of being treated like a burden while giving you $400 a month from a pension I can barely live on. David stared at her. She told me it was your idea, he said weakly. Margaret slid a bank statement toward him. Rebecca's been using my contribution to keep your household afloat. I overheard her say as much. You're in serious debt, David. I didn't come here to bail you out. I came here because I had nowhere else to go. David scanned the statement. Then the second. Then the letter from the housing board. His face paled. I didn't know, he murmured. She said we were fine. Tight, but fine. She said you didn't need to worry. That the pension made things easier. Margaret's voice was steady. But the truth is, I was manipulated into believing I was nothing without. And I nearly believed her. David sank back in his chair, guilt settling over his features like fog. I should have paid more attention. You didn't want to. Margaret's words were gentle, but firm. Because it was easier to let her handle things. Easier to assume I was just adjusting poorly. That Rebecca broke me. With words, with rules, with that smile that never quite reached her eyes. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time in years, Margaret saw the boy he once was confused, ashamed, and too late to fix what had already cracked. I'm sorry, Mom. I believe you, Margaret said, but I'm still leaving. Word spread quickly. That weekend, Michael returned, this time with Dorothy in tow. They helped Margaret pack her things into boxes marked neatly in her tidy script. Books, linens, photos, documents. Emma helped fold sweaters. Jake carried books. Rebecca lingered in the hallway, eyes narrowed, silent. The house no longer belonged to her in the way it once had. On Margaret's last evening in the house, the family sat down to dinner. David had insisted on it. Rebecca plated food with mechanical movements, saying little. Emma broke the silence first. Grandma, can we visit your new place? Margaret smiled. Of course. I'd love that, Jake chimed in. Will it have a park nearby? Maybe a butterfly garden? I think we can find one, Margaret said softly. Rebecca stood abruptly and cleared her plate. She didn't return. Later that night, Margaret stood in the doorway of the basement one last time. She looked at the bare walls, the window well full of leaves, the space that had become both her prison and her cocoon. She didn't feel bitter. She felt ready. The first morning in Dorothy's house was quiet. Not the kind of quiet Margaret had grown used to, the watchful, suffocating silence of Rebecca's kitchen, where even the clink of a spoon could draw a judgmental glance. This quiet was warm, untroubled. It wrapped around her gently, like an old shawl forgotten at the back of a drawer. Margaret sat at the small table by Dorothy's sunlit window, nursing a cup of coffee. No one told her where to sit. No one rolled their eyes when she added sugar. No one reminded her, subtly or not, that she was in someone else's space. Dorothy slid a basket of warm bread between them. You didn't sleep much, Margaret smiled faintly. I didn't need to. I think I've slept long enough under someone else's roof. Dorothy squeezed her hand. Well, this roof is yours as long as you need it. But something tells me you won't be here too long. She was right. The housing placement came through 2 weeks later. A modest unit in a senior complex on the edge of the city. It wasn't much. A single bedroom, a kitchenette, a view of a small community garden. But when Margaret stepped inside for the first time, keys in hand, she felt something she hadn't in months. Control. No one waited to comment on her clothes. No one critiqued her stories. No one threatened her sense of worth with every raised eyebrow and withheld smile. She unpacked slowly, carefully placing the photo of her late husband on the shelf beside her chair. She hung a few watercolors Emma had drawn in school, housewarming gifts. The girl had called them with shy pride. A few books, her tea kettle, the knitted scarf she'd never finished though it wasn't perfect. But it was hers. The weeks passed with a rhythm all her own. She joined a book club. She started helping in the community kitchen once a week, slicing vegetables beside women whose hands bore the same gentle tremor as her own. She walked every morning, her gait steadier, her eyes brighter at the end of each month. Her pension arrived, no longer swallowed by someone else's expectations. She paid her rent, bought good coffee, mailed birthday cards with pressed flowers tucked inside, sent a check to the butterfly garden Emma loved. She received visitors Michael, sometimes Dorothy, always the grandchildren. David came once. He brought pastries and apologies, but mostly silence. They talked awkwardly. Margaret didn't push. Forgiveness, she'd learned, didn't have to be loud. When he left, he kissed her cheek. "You look well," he said, almost surprised. "I am," she replied simply. One Sunday, at the request of the center director, Margaret agreed to speak at a local gathering for seniors dealing with family-based financial abuse. She hesitated at first, unsure what she could offer beyond her own bruised history. But when she stepped to the podium, looked out at the gathered faces, some proud, some ashamed, some quietly breaking, she felt the words rise. "I spent 3 months in a house where I paid for the privilege of being ignored," she began. A ripple of recognition moved through the room. They told me I was a burden, that I had no value outside a government check, and for a while, I believed them. Heads nodded, eyes filled, but I remembered who I was, not because someone rescued me, but because someone tried to erase me, and I saw myself more clearly. In the absence, she paused, letting the silence settle. "You are not your pension. You are not your age. You are not your usefulness to someone else's schedule." Scattered applause. "You are still here, and that means you are still yours." When she stepped down, an older woman took her hand, tears on her cheeks. "I thought I was the only one." Margaret shook her head. "You never were." A few months later, Emma and Jake visited her new apartment. They came bearing cookies and stories about school and a photo album they'd made together. Things Grandma taught us. Inside were pictures of Margaret helping Jake with his rock collection, of Emma learning to knit, of both children seated at her kitchen table eating. "Too many scones. This one's my favorite," Emma said, pointing to a photo of the 3 of them in the community garden. "You look like a queen," Margaret smiled. "A tired one, maybe." "No," Jake said firmly, "like someone important." She kissed their foreheads before they left. Watched them walk to Dorothy's waiting car. She felt no bitterness about the house she'd left. No hunger to return. Only love. On the anniversary of the day she'd moved out, Margaret stood in her garden plot, knees in the dirt, hands coated with soil. A butterfly landed on her sleeve, a flicker of orange and black. She didn't shoo it away, just smiled. Later that day, she walked past a woman sitting alone on the center bench, thin, grey-haired, her eyes darting nervously as if expecting to be scolded for existing. Margaret sat beside her without a word. The woman flinched slightly. "I was where you are," Margaret said gently. "Not long ago." The woman glanced at her. "What changed?" Margaret smiled, soft but unshakable. "I did.